Welcome to the Theology Made podcast. I'm Jordan. And today, we're going to look at St. Nicholas, the real story behind Santa Claus. Every December, a familiar figure reappears. Red coat, white beard, sleigh bells, reindeer. He's the symbol of generosity. He's the face of Christmas cheer. But behind the myth of Santa Claus stands a man who, brace yourself, didn't live at the North Pole or look like Tim Allen. He didn't slide down chimneys, but he did climb through windows to leave gold for the desperate. And once, according to legend, he might not have delivered toys, but he did deliver a punch to a heretic's jaw. This is the true story of St. Nicholas, a bishop, a defender of orthodoxy, and a man whose life reminds us that Christmas generosity was born not in the mall, but in the miracle of the Incarnation. The story begins in the coastal town of Patara. It's what's now southern Turkey, part of the Roman Empire's wealthy province of Lycia. Nicholas was born around AD 270 to Christian parents who, by all accounts, were both devout and very well off. But the world he entered was dangerous for believers. The Roman emperors still demanded loyalty to the old gods. Christianity was growing, but underground. And when Nicholas was still a young man, his parents died in a plague, leaving him a large inheritance. And this is where the story of Santa begins, not with reindeers and wishes, but with radical generosity. According to early sources, Nicholas heard of a poor man with 3 daughters. They were too poor to afford dowries. And in that culture, it meant the daughters faced being sold into slavery or prostitution. So Nicholas took a bag of gold, crept to the man's house at night, and tossed it through the window, enough for 1 dowry. He did the same again and again. When the father finally caught him in the act, Nicholas begged him, don't tell anybody, because the gifts weren't for fame, they were for love. That's why in the oldest icons, Nicholas isn't smiling. He's humble, often with hands raised in blessing, not in waving. Years later, Nicholas was chosen as Bishop of Myra, a port city on the southern coast of Asia Minor. It was a place of trade and wealth, but also political corruption and pagan superstition. So to be a bishop there, you were living in tension between empire and gospel, prosperity and persecution. And Nicholas, he shepherded his people through famine and poverty. When grain ships passed through Myra on their way to Constantinople, Nicholas famously begged the sailors to unload some of their cargo for the starving poor. They refused at first. The grain was counted and sealed for the emperor. But Nicholas promised, you're going to lose nothing. And so they relented. And when they arrived at the capital, the grain stores were mysteriously still full. The story spread quickly, and Nicholas's reputation as a man of both faith and courage grew. But darker days were coming. In the early 300s, the Emperor Diocletian launched the fiercest persecution the church had yet seen. Bishops were ordered to hand over their scriptures, to renounce Christ, to bow to the gods of Rome. Many fled, others compromised. Nicholas refused. He was arrested, beaten, and imprisoned, one of the countless pastors who chose chains over compromise. For years, the empire tried to silence men like him, and then, almost overnight, everything changed. AD 313, the Edict of Milan. Constantine legalized Christianity. The church walked out of the catacombs and into the sunlight, and Nicholas, frail, scarred, but unbroken, walked free. He became a living icon of endurance. To his people, he wasn't just their bishop, he was a confessor, a man who had suffered for the name of Christ. And then came the moment that would make him legendary. It was AD 325, and the newly Christian empire was fractured over a single question. Who is Jesus? Hundreds of bishops gathered in the city of Nicaea, summoned by Emperor Constantine himself. Some bore scars from persecution, others were philosophers and theologians. And at the center of the storm stood a priest named Arius from Alexandria. He was charismatic, tall, eloquent, trained in the classics. He sang theology like poetry, setting his ideas to catchy hymns the dock workers could hum while they labored. He was like a heretical Tom Bombadil. And his message spread. The Son of God, he said, is exalted above all creation, but he belongs to creation. There was a time when the Son was not. To Arius, Jesus was a perfect creature, the highest of beings, but not eternal. And to Nicholas, this was not clever speculation, it was blasphemy, because if Christ were not truly God, then his cross could not truly save. As the story goes, when Arius stood before the council to defend his teaching, Nicholas, his patience ran out. Arius argued with eloquence, quoting scripture out of context, twisting truth into something that sounded orthodox, but wasn't. And finally, the old bishop from Myra stood up. His eyes burning, not with rage, but with grief, he crossed the room, faced Arius, and in a moment of human weakness, or maybe holy fire, struck him across the face. The council chamber erupted. Gasps, shouts, confusion, assaulting a fellow cleric at the first ecumenical council of the church was scandalous to say the least. Nicholas was immediately stripped of his bishop's garments and imprisoned. That night, according to the old legends, Nicholas knelt in the dark of his cell and prayed, not for vindication, but for mercy. And as the story goes, Christ himself appeared, returning to him the book of the Gospels. Beside him stood the Virgin Mary, handing Nicholas his stole, the symbol of his pastoral office. And when the guards came in the morning, they found Nicholas sitting peacefully, clothed once again as a bishop, holding the scriptures in his hands. When the other bishops heard what had happened, they were struck with awe, and Nicholas was restored, not just to his seat, but to the church's heart. Historians debate whether the slap really happened, but even if the details blurred through legend, the meaning remained. Nicholas was a man who would rather risk disgrace than let the church forget who Jesus truly is. He knew the Incarnation was not an academic theory. It was the hinge of history, the truth on which every act of love, prayer, miracle depended. The baby in Bethlehem was not a demigod or a messenger. He was God himself in the flesh. And if that wasn't true, then nothing else about Christmas mattered at all. Nicholas died around AD 343 and was buried in his cathedral church, a bishop beloved by his people. But death didn't end his influence. Stories of his kindness spread across the Mediterranean faster than any ship could sail. Sailors would claim him as their patron, praying to St. Nicholas before setting out on dangerous voyages. Merchants invoked his protection over their trade and their families. And children whispered his name in bedtime prayers. And the poor, the ones he'd always care for most, told stories of miracles and answered prayers in his honor. By the early Middle Ages, his reputation had reached every corner of Christendom. In Byzantium, he was called the Wonder Worker. In Russia, Nikolai the Holy. In France and Germany, St. Nicholas le Bon. And on December 6th, the anniversary of his death, Europe erupted in celebration. It was called St. Nicholas's Feast Day, a holiday of giving, generosity, and joy. Children left their shoes out overnight, hoping the bishop saint would pass by and fill them with coins or small gifts. In some towns, clergy dressed as Nicholas and distributed bread to the hungry. In others, nobles disguised themselves as servants and gave food to the poor. It was the one day each year where the hierarchy of the world, rich and poor, priest and peasant, was turned upside down by generosity. And then came the centuries of reform and migration. When Dutch settlers sailed to the New World, they brought with them their beloved Santa Claus. In the melting pot of colonial America, English tongues reshaped the name Santa Claus. But the transformation didn't stop there. Over time, artists and advertisers took the bishop, robed in red, carrying a cross, and slowly remade him. His mitre became a fur-trimmed cap. His bishop's staff became a candy cane, his cathedral became a chimney, and his sermons were replaced with slogans. By the 19th century, poets and illustrators like Clement Clark Moore and Thomas Nast, they finished the metamorphosis. The saint who once defended the deity of Christ now sold Coca-Cola. The bishop who gave secretly so that Christ would be glorified was replaced by a mascot who gives publicly so that we might buy more. And yet, if you peel back the layers of legend and marketing, you still find him there. Behind the beard, beneath the red coat, a man who believed that because God gave himself, we must give ourselves too. That's the true inheritance of St. Nicholas. Not stockings or sleigh bells, but a vision of generosity shaped by the Incarnation itself. A gospel that gives before it asks, loves before it's loved, and descends before it demands. But history alone can't explain why Nicholas captured the world's imagination. It wasn't just his generosity that endured, it was the truth that fueled it. Beneath every act of giving, every whispered prayer to St. Nicholas was a deeper story. One about a God who descends into our poverty to lift us into his abundance. The legend of Nicholas only makes sense because it mirrors the larger miracle, that the greatest gift the world ever received wasn't wrapped in paper or gold, but in flesh. Nicholas didn't invent gift-giving. He imitated the gospel. His generosity flowed from one simple conviction, that God himself had stepped into poverty, our poverty, so that we might share in his riches. That's the theology of Christmas. Not sentiment, but self-emptying. Not magic, but mystery. And when Nicholas tossed gold through that window, he wasn't just rescuing 3 girls from despair. He was reenacting the Incarnation, giving in secret as Christ gave himself. And that's the real heart of Christmas. Not a man coming down a chimney once a year, but God coming down to dwell with us forever. Hey, if you've been listening to this story and you feel that same longing, the ache beneath the noise of Christmas, that's exactly what Advent is for. It's the season the church set aside to wait on purpose, to make space for the wonder of God with us. And that's why I wrote The Gift of Waiting. It's a short Advent devotional designed to help you slow down, see Christ in the silence, and rediscover the miracle Nicholas lived for. You can find The Gift of Waiting on Amazon or through theologymade.com. This year, when you see the Santa figurine or hear the jingle bells, remember the story beneath the story. A bishop who loved truth more than comfort and people more than prestige. A man who punched a heretic not for anger's sake, but for love, because he knew what was at stake if the world lost sight of who Jesus truly was. And maybe that's still the task today, to defend the truth of the Incarnation, not with fists, but with faithfulness, to give quietly, love deeply, and wait expectantly for the one who came and is coming again. Hey, if you enjoyed this episode, share with a friend and leave a review. And if you want to keep exploring the real stories and theology behind the traditions we take for granted, subscribe to the Theology Made podcast. Next week, we're going to look at Advent, the forgotten season of waiting.